Hello everybody and welcome. It's Morgana here today and I hope you'll all join me on a morning walk, which is the subject of today's demonstration painting. So I'm beginning today with a pre-drawn pencil outline. This outline I will make available for download on my Patreon page if anybody's interested. I'll link to that below, as well as providing a link to this beautiful reference photo that I'm using today on pixabay.com. As you can see, I've begun by just masking out this little detail of these white lines in the road using my Pebeo drawing gun that I'm showing you here. And now let's begin. The colours I'm using are on screen right now. I'll also pop a list of my full equipment and all my bits and bobs in the video description. But I'm starting now by using a big flat wash brush to just cover the entire piece of paper in a layer of clean water. I'm using hot press paper today, which is slightly different from your usual watercolour paper. It's very smooth, as you can see. The surface doesn't have that characteristic sort of lumpy, bumpy, bobbly texture. It gives us a really interesting effect when you're doing sort of shafts of light, which I will be trying to show you today. So I'm beginning with raw sienna as our first colour, putting it on in these big old sweeps from the top right corner. These are going to be the beginning of our shafts of sunlight. You can see I've put it on quite patchily and quite lightly, leaving some white space in between the lines. This is because I'm introducing now some pink as well. This is Opera Rose. It's a lovely bright and vibrant pink. It hits very, very strong as well, so do make sure you dilute this down for this sort of pale, if you're using it for this sort of pale, light sort of shaft effect. Do make sure you water it down properly, otherwise you'll end up with some really quite fierce fluorescent pinks. As you can see, I'm continuing to just sweep the paint down from that top right corner across the page. This is going to be our beautiful shafts of dawn light coming down through the trees. Don't need to take up the entire paper, as long as it takes up that key part sort of in the middle around the pencil figure that we've drawn just above the road. So I've got a couple of specks of fluff on my paper, just using a clean dry brush to remove those carefully. Don't want to make any marks in this first wash. And you can see I've left it very pale because I want the bright white of the paper to show a little through the paint to give us that lovely bright dawn glow, so to speak. Now I'm introducing a little bit of shade and shadow along the bottom here whilst our paint is still wet. This is ultramarine blue I'm using here, and just sweeping it along the bottom of the page here, using it quite a watered down, quite a loose mix. Now I'm just going to introduce a little bit of extra shadow around the edges of the painting. This is going to be where we put some foliage later on. So to help the foliage look a little shadier, a little deeper when we put it on, just introducing a bit of a darker colour into the wash to give it that depth in the background. So you can see I'm still using my flat brush. This is a 2-inch flat wash brush, and just introducing the colour quite carefully and quite quickly as well. With hot press paper you need to work quite quickly and smoothly, otherwise it gets very streaky. Now this is what it looks like now the paper has dried. I dried it off with a hairdryer because I'm impatient. You can see the colours have gone a little paler. We've got that softness there. We've still got that lovely soft directional lines coming down from the top right corner with the pink and yellow. And we've got this lovely bloom of ultramarine in the corners and along the sides, where I'm just beginning to now add a little bit of foliage. So I'm using a liner brush today. This is a Pro Art synthetic sword liner brush, but you can use whichever brush you feel most comfortable using. Just beginning to put in some misty foliage and this lovely statuesque tree, which is going to be on the left side here. Just beginning to do the trunk and a few bits of grass around it. And you can see I'm using really light paint. My paint is very watered down, and I'm using a mixture of the ultramarine blue and a little of the opera rose to give it that lovely dusty lilac tint. And I'm just quickly sketching in these branches as well, just to give a little bit of structure. The reason I'm using this light paint is because this is only the first layer in this this lovely background foliage we're going to create. You want it to be, the paint to be really nice and light and quite watery, so that it dries looking quite pale, so then we can layer some darker foreground foliage over the top a little later on. So all I'm doing, like I said, just putting in some of the structure of the branches and some preliminary sort of grassy little bits of foliage with my liner brush. And now I'm using a foliage brush. I favour the Matthew Palmer Tree and Texture brush. This is a size large. You can see it's making short work of putting some lovely impressionistic foliage into the branches of this tree. Again, I'm using the same mixture of really light paint. This is the first layer that I'm putting in here. Really, this painting should be called study in layering, because really that's the key technique to take away from this demonstration. For this sort of wistful and misty effect, you really want to layer up some really loose and light paint on the paper first. It gives that lovely impression of some mist and some distance, before then using sharper lines and richer paint to go into the foreground, which helps again to give the impression of distance. So as you can see, it's lovely and quick to put in a lovely first layer of foliage. You can see I'm not covering up these branches completely, leaving them peeping through. And now I'm just starting to layer up again some lovely shrubbery, some lovely hedgerow sort of lines of grasses, little clumps here and there along along the curve of the road that we've put in here. Just emphasizing the curve of that road, and then popping in some very loose sort of lovely grasses and flowers and bits and bobs just springing up along the roadside. You can see I'm avoiding the figure here that I've drawn in. You don't really have to worry too much about spilling over into those pencil lines, because they're going to be coloured in with a darker shade, so it will stand out against the grasses, so don't worry too much about spilling over the lines there. You put in as much or as little detail as you like at this stage, just going along that pathway and introducing your first layer of texture. You can see here I've just gone along the line of that road and just done some lovely loose clumps of impressionistic looking sort of grasses and shrubbery. Now I'm just going to do the same along this other side. Again, you can see how very light the paint is that I'm using. It's really watered down. Again, it's mostly ultramarine blue mixed with a touch of opera rose to give it that lovely lilac tint. again, just using the liner brush here to help soften down the straight line, that curve of the road, introducing here some little clumps and tufts of grass to just soften that line down a little, and definitely make sure give the impression of the road curving away into the distance beyond these tufts of grass that we're popping in here. So now, using the same technique that I've just showed you for the foliage and for almost everything else in this painting, I'm beginning to work on the lovely drift of leaves that's going to be coming down from this top right corner, following the reference photo as a guide rather than an absolute thing that I have to that I'm trying to follow and trying to precisely reproduce. You can see I've already adjusted the colours to something a little more wistful, and now I'm adjusting the sweep of the foliage coming down from this corner. Basically, I'm just using the texture brush here again with some nice light paint to just really just sweep in, trying to make it look quite natural, but also, you know, nice and pleasing to the eye. This sort of soft triangular drift of leaves, and you can see I've been alternating. Start with the light paint, adding in a few darker colours over the top, and just bringing it down into this corner where we already introduced a lovely bit of ultramarine blue as a shadow during the initial wash. So just emphasising that by bringing this colour down and adding in this lovely extra sort of loose shrubbery, give the impression of the shadow there and the lovely foliage again. So now I'm introducing a second layer into this lovely sweep of leaves coming down from the corner. Now I've let that first layer pretty much dry, and you can see now I'm coming in with some stronger paint. This is the ultramarine blue and opera rose again, and I mixed in a little bit of Payne's grey to just deepen the colour a little bit, give it an extra oomph of richness and darkness. And you can see again, just really simple, using the foliage brush to just dab over where I've already put the impressions of the paint in. But it's important not to fully cover the marks you've already made, because that's going to give the impression of depth and distance. So you can see I'm dabbing over quite lightly and leaving plenty of that initial light paint showing through, as well as some of our lovely bright background wash as well, the one with those lovely bright shafts of sunlight, which are really starting to show now that we're putting the foliage in. Here we are, see, using a little bit more Payne's grey here to begin introducing some lovely dark shades. Not all over, we don't want it to be too dark, but introducing the second layer now as well into this top left little bit of foliage here on our lovely tree. I'm not going too dark on this one. I'm only going to do this second layer, which is just bringing the leaves slightly more into focus, going over these softer marks that I already made with the texture brush, and just like I said, bringing them slightly more into focus, because this tree is a little further away from us, the viewer, from our imaginary camera that we're using to look at this beautiful snapshot. I don't want the foliage to be as dark and as rich in colour as the stuff that I've just been putting in from the top right corner, because that's really in the foreground, and this is more sort of a bit more background / midground, so we're trying to keep it quite pale. You can see as well that I've introduced even more foliage, sort of that first layer, coming down from the top right corner, using exactly the same technique, just that really light paint that I've dabbed on, bringing a few more lines down, sort of a few more of these lovely drifts down towards the centre of the painting. So now it's time for another layer. Just layering on that lovely rich paint, making sure that I'm not completely covering that first initial soft layer that we put on, just giving that lovely depth and detail into this lovely drift of leaves. And now again, just layering a little bit of darker colour into this foliage now on the bottom right corner, which is really strikingly in the foreground. So this is going to be quite dark, similar to the that top drift of leaves. That's also, you know, the foreground needs to be darker than the background. We want to keep the background nice and soft and misty. So I'm only introducing the Payne's grey and the darker, richer ultramarine colours into this foreground here. You can see I'm dabbing in some nice bright colours here, got a little bit of blue and a little bit of extra pink as well. And of course you can use whichever brush you feel most comfortable with for doing all of this, all this foliage. I would obviously recommend some sort of a texture brush, foliator brush. Obviously I also recommend the one that I'm using, the Matthew Palmer, because it is wonderful, it gives these lovely soft marks, but there are many others out there, so perhaps a little research is in order to find the one that's right for you. So now all I'm doing here is using a little bit of ultramarine blue, again watered down but not as much as it was before, and I'm introducing some shadow onto our main road here, because of course with these lovely beautiful overhanging boughs of foliage we're going to have some shadows. And I'm just using a medium-sized round brush to introduce this colour along the sweep of this road and in patches along this main part of the path around our walking figure. I don't want to cover the entire road in shadow. I want to leave some lovely bright little bits of light peeping through. But again, we must take into account the fact that there's all this lovely overhanging greenery, overhanging tree boughs, so it's important to make sure we put enough shadow onto the road to reflect that in our painting. And again, just using the texture brush to soften some of these lines and give that lovely dappled impression on some parts of this shadow which is coming from our lovely tree above. And if the colour goes on too dark, you can always use a little bit of scrunched up tissue to pull a little of the paint and water out and get it to the shade that you need. So now that I'm happy with the shadows that I've put along the pathway there, I'm beginning with the final touches now, putting in the foreground foliage, these lovely sort of wayside grasses that we've got springing up here along the path. Again, I'm using my liner brush, my sword liner, to put in these lovely loose thin lines. Use whichever brush works for you here. Could be a thin round brush, a flat brush, a rigger brush also would be great for this particularly. You can see I'm using stronger paint than I have done previously, just to make sure these nice thin lines stand out against the really soft diffused background foliage that I've already put in. That lovely ultramarine shadow we've got here, really going to make these lines stand out and look like they really are popping out of the pathway of the foreground here. Again, I'm using a mixture of the ultramarine blue mixed with some opera rose to give it that soft purplish tint. I've also mixed a little bit of Payne's grey into the mixture to give it that depth and that darkness to stand out against the paint that I've already used. And again, here you can use your own artistic interpretation. Use as much or as little foliage and grass as you see fit. For myself, I particularly love walking along these sort of lovely overhanging foliaged, heavily grassed paths with the sort of trees bending in overhead, the dappled light coming down in shafts through the leaves and really dappling those lovely paths with the grasses and those lovely wild hedgerows springing up on either side. So as you can see, I have gone quite heavy on the foliage with this, but there's no need to do that if you prefer something a little cleaner, more clean lines. Just go with whatever strikes you as right in the moment. As you can see, just working my way along the path with this slightly darker paint, introducing more grasses and more sort of this loose, lovely loose impressionistic shrubbery using the foliage brush. And as you saw as well, if you overspill with the brush as well, you can just use a clean tissue to just pull up a little bit of the paint nice and quickly before it leaves a mark or gets gets out of hand. So another quick technique with the foliage brush as well. Some really loose paint. You can see rather than dabbing, I'm sweeping it up and using it to create these soft, almost blurred lines that also give this impression of the shadowed hedgerow along the side of the path. It's a lovely and versatile brush, really. Perhaps I should have titled this video an ode to the foliage brush. Maybe I'll do a separate video on it. Very useful tool indeed for doing these sorts of watercolours. But now I'm back to using my round brush, and we're finally filling in our key figure here, this lovely silhouette of this lady walking along the path, enjoying her lovely morning walk in this beautiful sunlight. You can see I'm using the same soft mixture of colours. This is the ultramarine blue with a touch of pink and a touch of grey, just to deepen it down. And I'm working from the top down, keeping the paint moving, basically following the paint down with my brush, keeping it nice and wet so we don't get lines. I'm sort of trying to not let the lines dry out as I'm bringing the paint down from the top of the figure down to her feet. Just using my fine brush to just tidy up a few details where the round brush is a little bit large. Always just tidy up with a slightly smaller brush. But you can see here I'm just keeping on bringing the paint down, following the pencil lines that I've made, keeping the silhouette nice and clean until we get down to the feet. Using the fine brush again here, this is a Pro Art Series 16 miniature brush, size 4/0, to just pop in the detail here of Our Lady's cane or walking stick. Just using a careful, steady hand to get that line nice and straight, because it is a key detail here, both in the reference photograph and in my pencil sketch. Just love the idea of this lovely older woman just going for her morning walk along this beautiful country path. Maybe it's a short walk from her where she lives. Maybe she's on holiday and out for a stroll down to the local village to buy some breakfast. Who knows? I do love this sort of slightly illustrative kind of work. You can really sort of build a story around whatever it is you're painting. And of course, every person's interpretation is going to be slightly different. There really is a joy to paint something like this today. So now that I have the silhouette painted, just introducing a slight variation in the colour. Got some extra ultramarine in here. And this is just to add a little bit of dimension and shadow to the figure, who is in silhouette. Nevertheless, we've got some shadow on her from the trees above, and so introducing a slight variation in tone in the colour of the figure helps to make a silhouetted figure look slightly more three-dimensional and real, rather than something that's all one colour and sort of all one shape. You can see I'm just moving the paint around whilst it's still nice and wet, getting a little bit of variation here, keeping the darts on sort of her top of her head and her shoulders, and around the edges of her long coat here. So now that that figure is dry and all our reflections on the road is dry, just rubbing off the masking fluid here that we put on earlier and revealing again that lovely soft striped line that's really just gives that extra little detail to our pathway. And I'm not going to add any paint onto these, I want them to stay nice and white. And I love how they sort of leap out of the shadow that we've put onto the path there. So now all I'm doing is adding a little bit of extra detail. I've decided to introduce a little bit of extra pink around the foliage in the foreground. So what I've done is I've got my opera rose pink, which is lovely and strong. I've mixed it down with a little bit of Chinese white to give it a slightly more soft tone and a touch of opacity as well. You can see it is going over these dark colours we've put on. It's still holding its own, particularly in the foreground. Again, this is another entirely optional step. I just decided that looking at this painting, it had such a very blue and lilac-y tone, I decided to introduce a little more pink because this opera rose colour really is a stunner. And now for the last touch, this Chinese white, which I'm dabbing on here. Again, the Chinese white is opaque. You can see I'm just using the side of the foliage brush to dab on these little clusters of white, which look like these little clustered stars of flowers, just poking up out of that little cluster of hedgerow foliage there. And here we are with the finished painting. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I certainly enjoyed painting it. I love this sort of illustrative work. I love the colours and hues and textures that we managed to get. I hope you see that it wasn't actually too difficult as well. I know at first glance this sort of thing can look quite complicated and intimidating, but I hope that you've followed along step by step and you can see that actually just building up the layers and having a little bit of confidence with colour can give you some fantastic and beautiful results. So that's all from me today. Thank you so much everybody for watching. If you're interested in any more of my tutorials, please check out my page on Patreon. As I said before, I'll pop the link below along with a list of all my equipment. Thank you again for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, whatever you're up to, and I will look forward to seeing you all again in the next video.